Okay.
Hello, everyone. This is your host, Martin Willis, and I have a very interesting guest. We're going to talk about some interesting topics this evening. It's Paul Davids. He has been involved in all kinds of things. He's an amazing artist, and he's been in Hollywood. He's been involved in some films. He wrote a very, very interesting book about Forrest Ackerman, he was very close to him. As a matter of fact, he won an award, I think, at like 14 years old. I think it was something, I'm going to talk to him about that. But he started really young, had some interest in like monsters and things like that. Him and his wife have written some Star Wars series follow-up shows or something. You know, I'm going to get all the right stuff from him. And welcome to the show, Paul.
Hi, Martin. Yeah, we planned this for a long time, and it's good we're finally able to have the
Yes,
interview.
absolutely. And we met first out in Phoenix, and right away I really liked you a lot. You did magic tricks and all kinds of great stuff. You're well versed in about a million things, aren't you?
That's true. I make films. I'm an artist. I write screenplays and books, and am a magician as well when I have the opportunity to perform.
Yeah. I am hearing a little bit of noise from something. I don't know if it's a cord on your headset or what, but just to let you know, I am hearing that. And how did you get into writing and movies and all that? How did your path lead you to that?
Well, Martin, I was fascinated by movies from the time I was a very young kid. This was back in the days before video, and we had 8mm home movie cameras, and I started making my own films when I was even before my teenage years. As you mentioned, I was very interested in science fiction and monster films as a kid, and I made my own with animation, trying to imitate the style of Ray Harryhausen and Willis O'Brien, King Kong, The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. Those masters were my inspiration. And I did enter a filmmaking contest for Famous Monsters magazine when I was about 13 or 14 years old, and I was one of the winners. I got publicity in the magazine, and I got to know the editor, Forrest J Ackerman, at that age when I was very young.
Wow.
And that was a great opportunity. He had a very large influence on my path.
Wow. Yeah. I'm still hearing some noise. I don't know if it's a cable on your headset or whatever, but it's like making a constant clatter there. If you can figure out what that is.
Okay, let me try to adjust and see if we're any better off now. You were hearing a clatter.
Yeah.
You said.
Like if you moved or just anything. Okay, I don't know if you can put the cable behind you. And sorry for our live listeners. We'll get through this and figure it out real quickly, I'm sure. Okay, so at 14, did you say you won that contest?
Yes, and I got involved in animated cartoons when I was in college. I went to Princeton, and then was one of the first students accepted at the Center for Advanced Film Studies of the American Film Institute in Beverly Hills, and that gave me a head start in what I wanted to do. It was the opening year, and they chose 15 students they gave a fellowship to, and a small production budget to do a first student film. And I got to meet a lot of my heroes of Hollywood then.
Ah, wow, yeah. And you said you actually met Forrest when you were young. How did that happen?
He took a cross-country trip to go to the World Science Fiction Convention, which one year was held at the Statler Hilton in Washington, D.C. And I grew up in suburban Maryland, Kensington, Maryland, actually. And my friend who made those movies with me, Jeff Tinsley, his father Max took us downtown to meet Forry because he'd read in the paper that Forrest Ackerman was going to be there. And I had a chance to tell him about the childhood movies I was making, and he told me to come back the next day and I could show them, which I did, to a group of young monster fans and to Forrest Ackerman and his publisher. And they published some pictures from my childhood movies. You know, this was just a tremendous inspiration and boost for a kid who had these kind of dreams. You know, to meet a hero like this, to get that recognition, and I almost took a more straight and narrow path.
And like what were you thinking about doing for a career?
Well, the alternative was, I majored in psychology at Princeton, and it was during the Vietnam War. People were being drafted, but there were deferments for medical school, and I was, I took all the pre-med courses. I was thinking of applying to medical school. I was interested in psychiatry. I did early research with the psychedelics at the New Jersey Neuropsychiatric Institute. I met Timothy Leary when I was in college.
Wow.
And I actually worked with Humphrey Osmond, Dr. Humphrey Osmond, who coined the term psychedelic. He was the Canadian psychiatrist who experimented with mescaline and actually turned on Aldous Huxley with mescaline, and that resulted in the book The Doors of Perception. I was involved in all of that as a student, which explains why one of my first movies was a biography of Timothy Leary called Timothy Leary's Dead, which I was able to do at the end of Timothy Leary's his last year. It was either going to be medical school or it was going to be movies. And under the tremendous inspiration of The Yellow Submarine, when that film came out, and with my interest in cartoon animation and special effects, I applied to the American Film Institute and abandoned my medical career before it began. Wow. And I'm glad that I did. You know, there's a lot of doctors in the world. There's fewer people who do the kinds of things that I've done over the last 40 years.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Which is make a lot of films, produce and direct a lot of films, and I was one of the primary staff people on the original Transformers cartoons. I was the production coordinator. I was a writer on those cartoons. As you had mentioned, I had a contract after that from Lucasfilm to write Star Wars books, and then after that began producing and directing my films, a lot of which I'm sure the listeners to your program would know. I mean, I think everybody knows Roswell, the UFO cover-up of Showtime. So it's a long list of films now. You know, to mention Timothy Leary's Dead and Starry Night about Vincent van Gogh, and The Sci-Fi Boys was the history of special effects in movies, featuring Peter Jackson as the host. And I made the film Jesus in India and The Life After Death Project, and Marilyn Monroe Declassified was my latest one. I even did a Hispanic film, actually, a film with an all-Hispanic cast about a family in New Mexico based on a stage play. And I shot half of it in Mexico at some very exotic locations. That film is called Before We Say Goodbye. So it's been a path where I've chosen the subjects, and often about a person who was sort of rejected by society at large, but was a trailblazer who perhaps later was recognized. That's been a recurring theme.
So you kind of pick and choose what you're going to do. You're not like handed a screenplay or anything from anyone. This is all kind of all your baby?
It's all come from me. It's a very unusual career that way. And how did that start? Well, I guess the first one that I got launched was Roswell. That was actually my second film. I did a film about Vasilov Nijinsky that I wrote. I wasn't the director or producer, but it was called She Dances Alone. He was a Russian ballet dancer, was the greatest in the world in his time. And again, a very interesting case because he protested World War I. He went insane. He became catatonic. He spent his final decades in an asylum. There's been a few films about the story of Nijinsky and Diaghilev, and that was my first. Then I wrote Starry Night. It took 10 years to get it made. Before I got Starry Night made, I got Roswell made. That took 4 years.
Wow.
4 years from screenplay to finally getting a green light to make the film. It included a development deal at HBO for, I think it was about a year and a half of writing and working with Arthur Kopit, the playwright, developing it, and then HBO decided they weren't going to make it after all. They threw us out. We had to start over again, and we're very fortunate to get a green light to make it for Showtime. And after that film, well, it was very, very popular, widely seen, shown on TV many, many times. I made Starry Night with independent funds, risked my own house, and called in every favor I had, and made the film on a low budget. It was sort of like, the days of Ed Wood filmmaking, but miraculously, Universal Pictures picked it up for home video. And when that was a success at Blockbuster, then they put it on TV on Stars, and then they sold it all around the world. Lots and lots of deals for cable television, and then syndicated television, and enough money came in from that I could then, make another film. Oh, I did leave out the Timothy Leary biography. Actually came before Starry Night, and that was I partially financed it, and my friend Todd Easton Mills put up most of the money for that, and was a producer with me on that. The biography of Timothy Leary. Again, it was a huge success critically, and was fantastic at the Toronto Film Festival and the Venice Film Festival because Timothy Leary had just passed away. The film came out in 1997, and everybody was really intensely interested in Timothy Leary, the founder of the psychedelic movement at that time.
Yeah, I remember hearing. Well, I remember him being in. There was a song that used to. I can't remember the name of the song, but that used to say.
It was.
Go ahead.
It was by the
Right,
Blues.
right. That's right.
And it was called Legend of a Mind, and the lyrics were Timothy Leary's
That's right.
dead.
I love the Moody Blues too.
No,
So I should have known that.
Yeah.
I mean, he was. You heard it. I remember. I was very young. I think we're a few years apart, and but I do remember hearing like in maybe junior high all about Timothy Leary and like how controversial he was, and but the thing I don't ever remember, did he actually pass away from a drug overdose? Is that what happened? No.
Mm-hmm. No, not at all. No, it was cancer.
Oh, wow.
He had prostate cancer that metastasized, and then it was cancer. He knew about 6 months before he passed away that the end was near. But one of the things that's so interesting about Timothy Leary today, now that marijuana is legal in so many states, either for purely medical purposes or also for recreational purposes, Timothy Leary was sentenced to prison for 10 years for possession of one joint of marijuana.
Wow.
And he was first arrested in Texas, and then that went through appeals forever, and he wasn't in jail yet. And then he was arrested again in California when he was running for governor against Ronald Reagan. He ran as an independent, the psychedelic platform. And then they sent him to a low security prison. I think his sentence then was 5 years, actually, or actually in the end he served 5 years.
Still unbelievable.
But when they put him in prison and deciding where they were going to send him, they administered a psychological test to him that is given to all prisoners. And it's the Timothy Leary psychological test. He had designed the test at Harvard.
Oh, sweet irony. Yeah.
Sweet irony. He escaped from prison with help from the weathermen. It was the story of his escape. This is all in my film, which is called Timothy Leary's Dead, which is now online for streaming. It was out of circulation for a while, but you can find it again now. And Timothy, it's a documentary. He's in it throughout, and it tells the story of his life and the death he planned, which was to be cryogenic preservation, and then he canceled that at the last minute. Wow. Was cremated and had his ashes sent up into space with the ashes of Gene Roddenberry. This man was a trailblazer. Half of America thought he was a nut, and the other half thought that he was a sort of a messianic figure. So it was an important influence on American culture. Yeah. Timothy Leary. I was sort of the founder of the hippie movement, and he got a lot of blame during the Vietnam War protests, and he ended up spending 5 years in prison, most of it at Folsom Prison, some of it in the very next cell to Charles Manson.
Wow.
Okay.
Nice.
And he said, for a philosopher, that prison was the best thing that ever happened to him. He said he didn't have to think about women and orgasms. And he said he could write. He wrote half of his books in prison. And Timothy Leary wrote so much that there is a published biography. A bibliography. It just lists Timothy Leary's writings with a paragraph or a page about each one. And this bibliography is 300 pages long.
Oh, my God. I had no idea he wrote that much.
Yep.
Amazing.
Yes.
Wow, and he died fairly young.
Well, he was in his mid-70s.
I didn't realize that. I thought he was like in his 50s. Okay.
So, he kind of reinvented himself. He finally, Jerry Brown, when he was governor the first time in California, helped get him out of jail. And he kind of reinvented himself and then began, instead of psychedelics, to focus on the development of the internet and virtual reality. And he sort of abandoned the old phrase was tune in, turn on, drop out. And he sort of set that aside to encourage people to, drop into the new world of computers and technology. So the whole attitude kind of changed.
How about that? We're still getting that clicking noise. I don't know if there's some other way you can take the cable and if you can try to readjust the cable.
Okay, I've tried, and I'll try to remain very still.
That's no fun. Okay, so let's move on and talk about how you became really close friends with Forrest Ackerman, and a little bit about him first, if you would.
Well, Forrest J Ackerman was best known as the editor-in-chief of Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine. That magazine, under his editorship, reached almost 200 issues. And it's still been published in recent years by a publisher named Philip Kim, who, although he changed the format of the magazine considerably from what Farry had done originally, he honored Farry by calling him the honorary editor-in-chief, even posthumously. So Farry was born in 1916. He grew up with the early development of science fiction, horror movies, special effects, and he had a great passion for that. His early career was as an agent, science fiction writers, and he represented a lot of those who went on to become very important science fiction writers. He was very responsible for the beginning of Ray Bradbury's career. And through Famous Monsters magazine, he massively influenced, my old generation, the baby boomer generation, and then the generation of Peter Jackson that came afterwards. So many kids who went on to become major filmmakers grew up reading his magazine, which was a mixture of humor. He had a very wry, clever, unique sense of humor, often filled with puns. But he also provided an enormous amount of information about how the movies were made. And at that time, he provided secrets of special effects that weren't available anywhere else. So his influence cannot be underestimated. As a matter of fact, last November, through my efforts and the efforts of Jomo, who was his closest friend and caretaker the last decade of his life, and Sean Fernald, the producer and music supervisor, through our efforts with the Los Angeles City Council, we got the council to dedicate Forrest J Ackerman Square in Los Angeles, which is the intersection of Vermont and Franklin, right by the House of Pies. Mm-hmm. Why there, some people have asked. Well, the final house he lived in for the last 6 years or so was just 2 blocks from the House of Pies, and he would eat there all the time and hold court and audience with a lot of directors and writers and people in the field of science fiction and horror films who would meet him at the House of Pies, for lunch or dinner. Before he had that small house, he lived in a house that he called the Ackerman Mansion, which was in the Los Feliz district, not more than about 2 miles away from the final small house. And that large house was a repository of a massive amount of memorabilia of science fiction and horror movies and literature. So he had like 250 early edition books of Frankenstein and Edgar Allan Poe's, earliest publications, and Bram Stoker, and lobby cards of all the early science fiction and horror movies, and posters, and he had the props from the movies and the animated monsters themselves, and the house was filled with this. And he was a very generous spirit, and he had an open house every week. Anybody could come to see his collection. Wow. I spent a lot of time there with him. And, in my career in film, kind of grew up with Fari as a kind of father figure, or everyone called him Uncle Fari. So when I wrote the Star Wars books with my wife Hollis, we wrote 6 Star Wars sequel books. We dedicated one of them to Fari. He wrote the introduction to our very first book that Hollis and I wrote, called The Fires of Pele, Mark Twain's legendary lost journal. He hired me to write for a follow-up magazine he did to Famous Monsters called Monster Land. And, we socialized. He came to my birthday party when The Fires of Pele came out. I went to all of his birthday parties. He had a birthday bash every year. And one of the greatest nights of my life was when he invited me over to the Acker Mansion to meet Ray Harryhausen. And for those listeners who don't offhand know who Ray Harryhausen is, he was the great special effects creator of movies like Jason and the Argonauts and all of the Sinbad films, and early science fiction like The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, Earth versus the Flying Saucers, It Came from Beneath the Sea. I mean, Harryhausen is recognized as, along with Willis O'Brien, they were the first 2 great masters of special effects, and then everything else flowed from them. So through this close association with Fari, something strange emerged, Martin, and I know you want to talk about that because I made 2 films about that strangeness, that real life Twilight Zone that I want to talk about, and then wrote a rather large book about what happened, because after Fari died, my life turned upside down with strange things that happened.
And he, the title of your book, An Atheist, is it An Atheist in Heaven? I'm sorry, I don't have it right here in front of me.
Yes. Yeah, it's An Atheist in Heaven with the subtitle, The Ultimate Evidence for Life After Death, with a question mark. But the atheist was Fari. Fari was an atheist. He was proud of it. He, sort of a card-carrying atheist. He didn't believe in God or heaven or hell or prayer or He didn't believe in the paranormal. He didn't believe in life after death. He didn't even believe in flying saucers being real. So Fari was kind of an arch skeptic of his day.
Yeah.
But he left the crack open for that because something weird had happened to him when he was a boy. His parents were spiritualists. His parents, held seances. They did the Ouija board.
Huh.
And there was one Ouija board incident. Wait a minute. This is his grandparents, not his parents. His maternal grandparents, who really were a major force in raising him. So something strange happened with a Ouija board prediction that influenced his grandfather's career. His grandfather became an architect. He designed the Bradbury Building in Los Angeles. So he left the door open a crack, but he really wasn't a believer. But he said to me at one point, if it turns out I'm wrong, and I wake up to a great science fiction convention in the sky after Prince Sirki takes me away, he says, I imagine I'll have a lot of reunions there with my favorites like Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi and producer George Pal and my late wife Wendane. He said, but when the partying dies down, he says, maybe I would drop you a line, And then he kind of winked and he said, but don't count on it. Well, I didn't count on it, I didn't count on it. But he did drop me a line after he died, and that was just the beginning, Martin. My life has not been the same since 2009. He died in 2008, December. Mm-hmm. But we held a great tribute for him in March of 2009 at the Egyptian Theater in Hollywood. And, everybody who loved him was there, and many people spoke. Ray Bradbury spoke there, and Rick Baker and John Landis and Peter Jackson checked in from New Zealand by video, and I was one of the speakers. There were two fellows from Canada who'd made a biography of Fari. They showed their biography that night, and I had made The Sci-Fi Boys, which is one of my most popular films, won lots of awards. It's easily findable as a DVD or stream it online, or it's been televised many times. And that was a film about the development of special effects in movies from the earliest days up through Peter Jackson's King Kong. Peter Jackson was the host, and it showed Fari's influence in the whole field. So I was there as someone who had made a film about Fari. There were two Canadian filmmakers, and they had the first mind-blowing, chilling experience that they interpreted as communication from Fari that weekend of the tribute after they visited his crypt. And I want to say there'll never be time in our interview for me to give the whole scope of this and all the things that happened, but the projects I made that lay it all out there and give the truth and the facts and the real story of what happened after Fari died. There's the Life After Death Project. It's a documentary. I think you've seen it, Martin. And then I made a sequel to that, Life After Death Project 2, Personal Encounters. And the two of those are packaged together in the DVD if you find the DVD, or you can stream it online. And that was televised on Sci-Fi. And that tells the story as these strange things started to happen, some with physical evidence that I took to laboratories to involve scientists and have tested. This is the fascinating part of the story. That I'm not talking about contact like, channeling or something like. I'm talking about very specific, tangible things, sometimes witnessed by other people at the same time as myself, sometimes captured on videotape, sometimes with hard physical evidence that I took to chemistry laboratories, to top chemists to study. I got involved with 3 universities. It was Indiana University, University of Indiana, Indianapolis, Purdue, the College of New Jersey. There were chemists there that worked on these mysteries for 3 years. And then at University of Arizona, Tucson, Dr. Gary Schwartz, who then co-wrote An Atheist in Heaven with me. He has studied mediums, and he has studied attempts at spirit communication using technology for over 15, probably 20 years now, while at the University of Arizona, Tucson. It's been a wild, wild ride, Martin, and I just ask my listeners to understand how serious I am about all of this. I mean, people make fun of these things, or they dismiss you, he's a believer, or they think you're gullible. But I have put this together in the most scientifically acceptable way I think anybody could, to show the credibility that I think that all of these incidents of Fari dropping me a line have complete credibility.
Yep. Let's talk about a couple of situations. You mentioned the two gentlemen that had something happen. Now I know they knocked on his crypt and said hello. You know, they actually filmed that, which was in your documentary.
Yes.
And then later on, they go to the mansion there, the room that they were staying in. Yeah. Why don't you?
Yeah, it wasn't a mansion. It was a hostel in Hollywood. It was an old, 2-story building where people come to town, rent a room.
I see. Uh-huh.
And the two Canadian filmmakers, Ian Johnston and Mike McDonald, were sharing a room. They both had their computers set up on a bureau. And Michael, after returning from the crypt, attempted to post a blog. I think it was, I'm not sure if it was on Facebook, but it was, the posting of the blog required that he fill in a CAPTCHA code. Yeah. Those CAPTCHA codes with the squiggly lines, the squiggly letters and numbers, so that they know it's a person, not a robot, computer trying to spam. And the CAPTCHA code that came up after they returned from his crypt was his name. It was Ackerman 000. And that started it. That was the first day. It just, blew their minds. And while they were looking at it, the second computer was plugged in. It was booted up, but it was asleep.
Yeah.
And when it was Ian. Ian made the comment, this Ackerman 000, what does it mean? Ackerman reboot? Ackerman, relife? Is he really dead? The second computer spoke to them at that point and said, "Oh my gosh, no way," and said it with a childlike voice. The screensaver on that computer that Ian had posted there was a picture of Fari as a child at the age of 4.5. And that voice, turns out, it was an animated emoticon that can be found on YouTube of a little smiley face saying out, oh my gosh, no way, and then it rolls over on its side. The thing here was that he wasn't logged on to the internet. And as he said, my computer had no business, speaking to me. That where was the voice coming from? It wasn't in his hard drive, and why would it blurt that out as if in response to his comment? So the two of them were spooked, and Ian was a disbeliever, a very strong skeptic in these kinds of things, whereas Michael felt that he had lived in a haunted house, that he had lived with ghosts. He was absolutely a believer in, spirits. So you had the two guys there shaken by this, and they told people about it that weekend at the memorial, the tribute for Fari. And I heard about it then, and, I didn't know what to do with it. Was I a skeptic? I can't say that I was a believer in life after death at that point. I had some reason to take it seriously. Let me backtrack a moment and tell why. Back in 1983, I worked for F. Lee Bailey, the attorney.
Oh, yeah.
Famous attorney. You know, he was one of the defense attorneys on the O.J. Simpson case. And he had a television show called Lie Detector. And I had been hired as one of the several segment producers. And we would find stories. People would contact us. They wanted to tell their story on TV and have a lie detector prove what they were telling was true. And I brought in a psychic detective from New Jersey named Dorothy Allison. And she was a fascinating woman. And she came in with a whole dossier of files with letters from police departments commending her on having solved various cases. And she used psychic means, communication with departed murder victims to find bodies that had never been found. And she had been successful time and time again. So that was 1983. She passed her lie detector test. I read the book about her. It was quite convincing. So my mind had to be open to the fact that, you know, this could be true. But now consider, from 1983 up till 2009, at the Tribute of Fari, I hadn't done anything with that. I hadn't done any further research. I hadn't read any further books. I hadn't explored it. You know, I had a curiosity about the possibility of reincarnation. I read about, well, the writings of Paramahansa Yogananda, and I thought that was fascinating. But this was not my thing. It was not my field. So why, 2009, after that tribute, would I have become so completely immersed, and some could say obsessed, and I wouldn't argue with them, because once I had that first contact, I was shaken. I was really shaken. I couldn't deny what happened to me, which involved a document in my Santa Fe house. I was alone. The doors are locked. The document is ordinary. I've printed it out. The ink had dried 2 hours before. I'm out of the room for 5 minutes. I come back in, and the document has been changed while I've been out of the room. And now, as I look at it, there's 4 words that have been precisely, neatly, surgically blacked out with 2 different levels of blackness, and the ink is still moist on those words. And this is no accident. It's clearly was done deliberately. You know, this isn't water dripping from the ceiling or a leaky pen in the bed. This was done on purpose, but there was no one there physically who could have done it. It just shocked me. I'd never had an experience like that before. And I considered, you know, it as a possible message. It took me a while to figure out why it was a message and what the message would be. And this is the first line that Fari dropped me, literally a line of text. He was an editor, right? He communicated with text. And he had dropped me a line, 20 times from all around the world while he was alive with postcards from various countries. He dropped me a line to say hi. And now he was deceased. And he dropped me that line, and it was... see the movie, The Life After Death Project, read the book, An Atheist in Heaven, to understand all the details. But it was, as it turns out, a kind of a thank you for my participation in his tribute. That's my interpretation of it. But that was just the first communication. And all kinds of strange things that I couldn't explain, like living in the Twilight Zone for real, started happening, and even the very next day.
Wasn't there... Well, I want to talk just a little bit more about this document, but wasn't there like over 100 things that you documented that of strange things? Or was it that? It was.
Yes. In the book, An Atheist in Heaven, at the end of it, I have a glossary. By the way, the movie Life After Death Project came out in 2013. An Atheist in Heaven, the book, which is both a hardback or a Kindle, came out 3 years later. So that takes us through 2016. And Chapter 27, the addendum, is a list of phenomena. And while not every single one of these necessarily is related to Forrest J. Ackerman, They're all related to afterlife communication, and there are 142 different incidents listed that are talked about in the book. And more than half of them happened to me, and many of those happened with other witnesses, as I said. We're either caught on film or just the dinner party at my home when in a room with a portrait of Forrest J Ackerman and a huichol mask from Mexico on the wall, and I tell a joke that I knew would have been one of Fari's favorites, and at that moment, everyone at the dinner party sees the mask leap off the wall, fly over a lampshade, and land right at my feet.
Oh, and didn't you do some testing, and there was some type of magnetic issue or electronic issue or something?
Yes, that's the, I don't necessarily remember all these technical terms at the tip of my tongue, but the electromagnetic field, EMF testing, ghost hunters use devices to test electromagnetic fields. And it's a way of finding out, is there an anomaly that's causing that? Or maybe there's something natural that's causing it. But in my house in Santa Fe, the vacation house, the day after the ink incident happened, I had someone over who brought an EMF reader, and she was taking readings around the house, in the bedroom and then the living room. And I had this African mask on display in a display case. It didn't have any metal parts to it, so you wouldn't think, there'd be anything electromagnetic about it. But we filmed this, and there were massive electromagnetic measurements coming off this thing. The device was, blinking at full speed, beeping at its maximum loudness. And at that time, and this is in the film, it was caught on film, she pointed it at my head. And that thing had the same immensely high reading as she pointed at my head. It was scary. I mean, she moved it up and down my body, and when it got to my brain, this thing went off the charts. Now, that's the only time it's done it, that happened, but it did happen. It was caught on film, and there was also an electronic voice phenomenon, an EVP that appeared on that videotape in the living room of that house that day that also was unexplained and was very strange. And we discovered it when we played the video back. This was just this lady with that device and me in the house. And when we played it back, we could hear a voice after she measured that thing on my head. And then as she was moving it back to the mask, there was a voice that said very clearly one word. It said, Lenore. Now, without jumping to 1,000 conclusions, I will point out that Lenore, it's a famous poem by Edgar Allan Poe, and if you know The Raven, Lenore is the lost love that he's talking about in The Raven. Forrest Ackerman was one of the biggest promoters of Edgar Allan Poe that there was in Hollywood, in addition to Roger Corman, who made several movies based on Edgar Allan Poe stories. His Famous Monsters magazine was always filled with Poe, and it inspired me from a young age to read a lot of Poe. So I don't know. I don't know whether Poe had joined Forrest that day and was looking on. I mean, that mask was really strange, and I think it was maybe the only thing in my house that would have actually qualified to be a collector's item in the Acker Mansion back in the day.
Yeah, and he had a huge collection
of masks. In addition to everything else, a big collection of masks of all kinds. This mask, which was a gift from my fellow producer of Timothy Leary's dad, Todd Mills, this mask had been acquired after it was danced in a tribal ceremony in Zimbabwe. Todd had been there. He saw the ceremony. He bought the mask. He had it on display in his own house for many years. And when I got the Santa Fe house, he gifted it to me, and it was there on display in the house. And it frightened me after that. I've got to say,
I bet.
enough things happened in that house. I didn't want the mask in the house anymore. And the lady with the EMF reader took it to her house. We put it in my car. We drove it to her house, and she babysat the thing for the next couple months, I think. And she reported all kinds of paranormal activity that happened once she brought that mask to her house. I mean, a long, long list of strange things. I mean, doors that she locked in the middle, when she went to bed at night would be unlocked and wide open when she woke up in the morning. Skunks would get into a fight underneath her house, just directly underneath where she put the mask. She had about 12 cats in the house. They didn't like the mask. They would hiss at it. I mean, this is what I was finally, tossed into the middle of.
Wow.
But this is all what happened before I made my trip to Indiana University to Dr. J. Siegel, one of the top chemists in the country, who agreed that he would take that, we called it, his term was obliteration, ink obliteration, that he would begin subjecting it to scientific tests. And that is one of the key things about the mystery here that I think should make this case absolutely fascinating to those who are scientifically minded.
Yeah.
Because...
I do have that document showing up on YouTube right now for anyone that's watching this live.
Okay.
But before I move on, there's something I forgot to say earlier is to the people in the chat room, thank you for joining the chat room. I'm actually made a decision recently that I'm not going to be participating in chat. I'm going to be concentrating with the guest. But I do have someone monitoring the chat for any questions, and so that will forward questions to me through a text. So if anyone has any questions for our guest, just go ahead and post them up on the chat room, and I will get those questions for our guest tonight. So sorry about that, Paul.
Yes.
So,
I was introducing the chemists into the story,
mm-hmm.
And Dr. John Allison worked on this for 3 years, and he could never duplicate the ink obliteration, trying everything. These two chemists, Dr. Siegel and Dr. Allison, are world-class authorities on inks, paints, solvents. If anybody had the background to determine what happened there that caused that, it would have been these two men. And unable to reproduce it using any solvents. And he actually contributes 2 chapters to the book An Atheist in Heaven, Dr. Allison, where he explains that any chemist could appreciate what the problem was, why he couldn't reproduce it. He could determine what the actual chemistry was, and that too was extremely mystifying. Why it would be what showed up. So, from my point of view, you see, he was there as as the skeptic, as the person to treat it like like a crime scene, and he didn't know whether he could believe me when he began this. He got to know me in the course of this, but as he says in his chapter, he had to start out treating me as a skeptic. How did he know that I wasn't somebody who was coming to pull a fast one to see if he could figure it out? He finally concluded that there's no way I could have been involved in the ink obliteration, that I couldn't have done it if I had wanted to do it. He couldn't do it. If he couldn't figure out with all of his scientific tools after 3 years. But there was the additional fact that he, and I don't like to loosely use the word haunted, but let's use it here. He became haunted in the course of studying this over 3 years. The number of strange things that started to happen to him, it was like what was happening to me. And one of the strange things that happened to him also happened to one of the tenants who was then living in the Acker mansion that had been remodeled. long after Fari had vacated, there was phenomena happening in the Ackerman Mansion.
Right. Yeah.
We even, in the year 2016, held a seance there in the Ackerman Mansion with scientists present, university professors, several of them, and some psychics that Gary Schwartz had studied, who ran the seance. And we had phenomena happen during the seance that was caught on film that we couldn't explain. I mean, I guess, the long and short of it is that I conclude that, Fari does still exist as conscious spirit, that he has continued to remain involved in my life and in this whole process of communication from what some people call the other side. I think it's real. I think that he has expended this effort in order to let us know. As he said, if it turns out I'm wrong, I'll drop you a line. And he has been proceeding with a passion. And I can tell you that some of the latest things that have happened to me, stemming from the day of the dedication of Forrest J Ackerman Square, have been some of the most amazing of all. They aren't even in the book because they happened after the book was published, but some of the most amazing of all. So this is my story.
Well, yeah, I want to hear about some of those. But the document, what is the significance? It says Sarah Bernstein, HBO, and then just below spoke to, and that's where it's all like blacked out, redacted, as they say. Left a message for Joe Mode. That was his caretaker, right? Joe Mo?
Well, Joe Mo was the caretaker, but what the document was a printout of my log of phone calls and business meetings for, let's see, let me get the years straight. So this would have been for 2008. And I had printed it out. It was 24 pages. I printed out and I had it in March because I was reviewing it for tax purposes. I was, figuring out, what business lunches did I have and who had I met with, and the business phone calls were there too. So, the Sarah Bernstein HBO, that was, a conversation I had at that time with an executive at HBO. And a few lines up from that, it says, left message for Joe Amadei. Well, Joe Amadei, I don't know what he's doing now, but at that time he was a distributor of DVDs in New York, and my phone call to him was to find out if he would be interested in distributing my film. Now, let me remember the details. When I called him then, I think it was about Jesus in India. Mm-hmm. My film Jesus in India was finished in 2007, and I don't remember when the DVD came out, but I was calling him about Jesus in India, trying to get wider distribution for it. And so I left a message for him, and the words that are blacked out, from a few days later, it said, spoke to Joe Amadei. So,
oh, I see.
That's when I spoke to him. Now, the first mystery about why would those words be blacked out was because what would the significance of Joe Amadei be? Why would, if you assume that the blackout is a message to me of some importance happening from some invisible, unseen intelligence while I'm alone in my house, why that? I mean, I didn't know Joe Amadei. I had one conversation with him. We didn't do any business together. So if there was some emergency in Joe Amadei's life, why tell me? It didn't make any sense. And I sweated over this. It really bothered me for days. And as I began to think, could this be a line from Fari Ackerman? Well, I asked myself, did Fari black out entire words like that when he edited? Some people just draw a pencil through something. Is there any precedent for that? How can I find documents of manuscripts that he edited to see if anything looks like that? So I put in a call to Joe Mo, who was his caretaker and closest friend for the last 10 years. And Joe had been one of the main guys who had organized the whole tribute. Mm-hmm. So shocking thing that happened was when I called Joe, he didn't even let me tell him why I was calling. He was so excited to tell me. He said, I'm a skeptic like Fari. I don't believe in these things like spirits. He says, but I have to tell you that after the tribute, I had an experience I can't explain that seemed more real than reality itself. He said, I think it happened moments before awakening in the morning, but it was more real than reality. Fari had come into my room. We talked. He told me the things that Fari had said to him. It was a thank you for the tribute. And he said then Joe opened his eyes and everything looked exactly as it had in this surreal experience, except there's no more Fari there. And he said, Paul, he said it was just as if Fari came and spoke to me. And at that moment, all my alarm bells went off, Martin. It was like an electric shock through my spine, because when he said it was as if Fari came and spoke to me, and this is Joe Moe telling me this, and I'm looking at the words that are blacked out, and they say, spoke to Joe Mo-D. And Joe Moe's name is right there in the middle of, and I know that Fari, who loved puns, had this game he would play of finding names within names. It's what he did. It's all in Famous Monsters. You could find so many examples of this wordplay of finding a name within a name. So I even had an example in something that he autographed for me where he said, hooray for Harryhausen. And he spelled it HOO-RAY, Ray Harryhausen. So he's got the name Ray in the middle of the word hooray. Yeah. That's what Fari did. And here I've got spoke to Joe Mo-D. Joe Moe's name right there. He's telling me he spoke to Joe. He's telling me he spoke to Joe. Joe's telling me he spoke to me. Wow. Joe's telling me he appeared to me in spirit, and he spoke to me. He thanked me for the tribute. He's letting me know. In case Joe doesn't believe it or thinks it was a dream, he's telling me, by the way, I spoke to Joe. This was the only interpretation I could give to it. Nothing else ever made sense. Yeah. And the fact that it was followed by all of these other things that continued through the years, right up to incredible things that have happened since last November, I think it's real. And the book and the movie is the best job I can give with full honesty. I even signed a sworn affidavit that I've reported it accurately. I'm not exaggerating. I haven't made any of this up. This is the report of the communications of Forrest J Ackerman after he died. It's proof of life after death.
Well, I have heard, and I've had a situation myself with my grandmother, but I've heard a lot of people talk about dreams. And from my own experience, it was one of the most realistic dreams I ever had that I can recall. So did he say it was a lucid dream?
Yes. I don't know if he used that word lucid dream, but he said that it happened just seconds before he woke up in the morning. But he said it was taking place in his room. It was more real than reality itself, so that when he woke up, he felt he was coming down from a level of reality. Mm-hmm. But what his eyes were seeing was the same thing, except Fari wasn't there anymore.
That's
what he
wild.
said.
So let's hear some of the other things that has happened since November of 2016. You said some other things have happened that are pretty amazing.
Yes, and I report this with trepidation. I haven't reported it publicly before that I know of, because it involves a movie project that I can't name the people that are involved, but I can say some things about it. It so happened that right after the tribute to Fari, I got a phone call from an agent who had helped me out about a decade earlier, and I'd seen him at a few events from time to time, and he's a friend of my wife, but we hadn't really done business together and talked business in a long time. And he talked to me about there needing to be a project that would have an actor and Forrest J Ackerman and Ray Bradbury and sort of deal with those things. And he said he knew I had made the Sci-Fi Boys, and he wanted me to send it to him for a certain actor he represents that everybody knows, which I did. And but he didn't know about the Ackerman, the dedication that day. The timing of the phone call, he had no clue that had happened. He was amazed when I told him I had just come from that. Now, within an hour of that, I'm driving along, and I had written a screenplay that sort of answered to what he was saying should be done. I had written it back in 2010, and I don't want to go into too much detail about it, but I want to tell you that a car pulled in front of me shortly after that phone call that had a license plate that practically had the name of my movie on it, with ACK also in the license plate for Ackerman. I took a picture of it, and it's very, very specific to the title of my film and the ACK. So I won't say much more about it now, except I wanted to take it as a sign, of course, that something really good could happen with this project, and everything is in motion now for something really good to happen with that project, and I'm waiting to see if it will.
I'm surprised you didn't track that person down and say, hey, why do you have that license plate?
Well, I just got a picture of it when it was stopped at a red light. Then as soon as the light turned green, that car sped off. And I guess there would be some way to track it down. Yeah. But, what I think about this, because there have been a number of license plate incidents where there's something very strange and specific that happens at a specific time. The person that gets a vanity license plate has his own reason for that license plate. It probably meant something completely different from him, but it served as the trigger to me because I saw the name of my movie in it with the reference to Ackerman. So they call those things a synchronicity, meaning a really, really improbable coincidence, but not just a coincidence that has an intense emotional effect on the person that experiences the coincidence. Mm-hmm. Carl Jung came up with that term, the psychiatrist. He came up with synchronicity and wrote a lot about that. There's been a lot written about synchronicities, and I've had many, many of those kinds of experiences since the strange things began.
One of the things, I think about, so Forrest J Ackerman was, someone pretty incredible, but wouldn't you think that other people would be able to have just as much power over doing something that he would? What would make him special? Yes, absolutely. You see, absolutely. There is a theory that those people that are sort of larger than life in life, are larger than life in death. But when I teamed up with Dr. Gary Schwartz, professor at University of Arizona, his research goes exactly to your question, because he has been attempting communication with various spirits of people that had great impact while they were alive. In some cases, one of them is his own mother-in-law, another woman who was a writer about life after death, who was sort of a mentor to him in his research. And at the University of Arizona in Tucson, he has what he calls the Laboratory for Advances in Consciousness and Health. So in addition to testing mediums, he has developed software, he's used sensors, he's developed programs to attempt communication with spirit that is measurable, and where background noise can be ruled out, where the timing of it can be sort of predetermined,
he has a computer program where you'll see a bar graph moving along the screen of the computer, and he'll attempt communication with a specific spirit. Now, he's done this with Forrest J Ackerman with positive results, and we filmed this, and you see this in the movie. But he's also done it with other spirits, if you will. And there are situations where he'll ask a question for a yes or no response, and it'll be very quickly followed by an anomalous burst of radiation that is measured on the bar graph. So this is his specialty of research. In the movie The Life After Death Project, you will see things filmed in his laboratory while the attempt at these communications is taking place. And he's written many papers about this. And he has extensive theories about it. But he certainly believes that spirit survives physical death and can communicate with us, which is sort of the foundation of what they call spiritualism, which is what Harry Houdini debunked, and many others have debunked, attempted to belittle through the years. And yet, Gary would certainly claim that there is now scientific evidence for this theory that was not available in the days of Harry Houdini.
Oh. Yes, and what didn't Harry Houdini say that he was going to try to communicate with his wife when he died, and they attempted to, I don't know if they did seances, or do you know anything about that?
Yes, they attempted communication, I think, many times. I don't know whether it was on his birthday or the anniversary of his death. And his widow never felt that communication had been made. There were, however, some interesting and strange things that I'll mention. I mentioned in the book. The last time they attempted the communication, it rained in Los Angeles that day, only on top of the building where they were attempting the communication. There was rain there. Only there. And this has been written up. Then, on a recent major anniversary of Harry Houdini's death, we have the Magic Castle in Los Angeles. We have a Houdini seance room in the Magic Castle. It's filled with Houdini memorabilia. The locks and chains, these things he escaped from, the straitjackets. And on the anniversary of his death, there was a fire that broke out that day in the Magic Castle. And the fire department declared the fire out it was the time of his death. It coincided with the time that Houdini had died. And I found out later that the damage in the Magic Castle, including the water damage from the hoses, went right up to the Houdini seance room and stopped there. There was no damage to the Houdini seance room. So, the skeptics will say, makes a great story. It's a coincidence. How many coincidences does it take? Along with physical evidence, along with instrumental transcommunication, electronic voice phenomena, along with vetted mediums who have been tested by a university professor who has a PhD from Harvard who taught at Yale. Gary Schwartz brought a few different mediums to this project who he felt had special talents. We filmed the readings. They're in the Life After Death Project and extensively discussed in An Atheist in Heaven, the book. And their readings were extraordinary. They were kept completely in the dark. They didn't know who it was we wanted to communicate with except for a first name. They weren't told who I was, so they had nothing to go by. And what came out of it was amazing. Just like our experience of that seance at the Acker Mansion. which, as I say, Martin, I filmed it, and we were there 3 nights and 4 days doing experiments at the Acker Mansion, and I must have done 15 hours of videotape from that, which I haven't edited yet, and I do consider that one of my projects for this year. Finally get around to editing all the interviews and everything that happened on those 4 days.
Now, talking about a coincidence, the painting that you have on the cover of your book,
Yes.
that has a clock in it, and didn't he die at the exact time? Forrest Ackerman die at the...
Yes,
Go
let
ahead.
me amplify that. The cover painting of the movie DVD, the Life After Death Project, has a painting by L.J. Dopp, an artist I greatly respect. I recommend you find his website and look at his art online. He specializes in paintings that relate to Hollywood movies of science fiction and horror genre. He painted that portrait of Forrest J Ackerman, and there was a clock in the background with the hands of the clock at 2 minutes to midnight. He painted it in 2004, 4 years before Forrest died, and it turned out that on December 4th of 2008, Forrest died at 2 minutes to midnight. So in a way, the painting predicted the time of his death. We used the same painting on the cover of An Atheist in Heaven, but the clock isn't there on the book. But a couple other things related to this I want to tell you that are intriguing. Remember I told you that I got that phone call after Forrest J. Ackerman Square was dedicated, and then came the license plate. It so happens that L.J. Dopp was with me when that phone call came, and I was driving him home when the license plate, car with that license plate, pulled in front of us. So that was interesting. But the other thing that's really interesting is that when Fate magazine decided to publish an article about this, they had me write an article called The Strange Case of Forrest J. Ackerman. And on the first page of the article, about 3 paragraphs down, I was talking about L.J. Dopp and his painting and how it predicted the time of Forrest's death. And right there, there's a massive misprint in the article, which has words, I didn't put them there, nobody put them there, but it refers to the inkblot obliteration. And what it says is, it's right in the middle of, I was saying the name L.J. Dopp, and I think right after the L or the L.J., it says the inkblot in 2 levels of opacity spoke to Joe Amodei. And then it repeats, the inkblot, 2 levels of opacity spoke to Joe Amodei. And then it goes on with the article the way I had written it.
Oh, that is really weird.
Why was it there? Why was it there? Why did it happen? And again, 2 levels of opacity, it creates a little more evidence because the spoke to, you can kind of read through it, but the name, Joe Amodei, completely blacked out. And then in Fate magazine, it repeats twice. And again, it has to do with lines of text. It's the ink again. And then, oh my God, I talked about the autograph, hooray for Harryhausen. Mm-hmm. He signed one of his magazines, Famous Monsters, a few years before he died. He autographed it for me. Hooray for Harryhausen and Paul Davids, Forrest J. Ackerman. He signed it right above an entry in the table of contents of the magazine that said, "The invisible inkmen strike again."
Wow. There's an awful lot of irony, if nothing else. It's really something.
It goes on and on and on and on, on and on and on and on. And I have an iPod that has so much music in it, and it had been set to Bob Dylan. I've been listening to Bob Dylan again and again for days, and I spent an afternoon with a couple of Forrest's close friends talking about him for hours. And I got in my car and I turn on the car, and the music comes out of the iPod. It's not Bob Dylan, but it's the Phantom of the Opera.
Oh, but tell me you had it.
Oh, and Fari always made the joke, saying that he wanted to be in the remake of Phantom of the Opera, and he wanted Oprah Winfrey to play the woman who pulls the mask off, and he said, we're going to call that movie The Phantom of the Oprah. Yeah, so it was one of his things, The Phantom of the Opera, Lon Chaney, and my music changes to The Phantom of the Opera after spending 2 hours talking about him with friends. I can't explain it.
Wow, interesting. So I think we're going to call it a show. I want to thank you so much, and please do tell the listener out there where they can find you. First of all, you have your pauldavids.com, right? Isn't that it? Your main website?
That's a website that has, but that's a little out of date. Paul Davids, and then a little hyphen, and then the word artist.com is very up to date, and it also has a massive collection of my art, in addition to entries about the books and the movies and the stage play of Starry Night. And I'll also say you can find, I think, all these different projects I've done, I think, are still findable at Amazon. The latest movie, Marilyn Monroe Declassified, which gets into the mystery of her death, it came out in November. And if you look me up at imdb.com, the Internet Movie Database, Paul Davids, you'll have the long list of, all the different movies and all the Transformer shows. There were 79 of them I was working on. And all of it listed there if you want to track those things down, and I encourage you to see them.
Great. Well, hey, as always, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, Paul.
Thank you for letting me go into such detail, Martin. I really appreciate every opportunity for people to understand the sincerity of this.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. All right, well, you take care, and hopefully I'll see you out in Phoenix next February if you make it out there.
I will try to make it a point to.
All right,
thank you.
Take care. All right, everyone, thanks so much for hanging in the chat room, and I don't think we had any questions tonight, but I do appreciate you participating. Thanks so much. So next week, we are coming back with Edwin C. May. He was part of the Stargate project back in the 70s, where they did remote viewing and, for the government, remote viewing. And they studied ESP and all kinds of things like that. And the title of the show, it has something to do with, hang on just a minute, I will get there. And it's a new book that he just released, and it is called, or I think this was his title, Psychic Spies, the Russians, and Research, the Inside Story. So it should be an interesting show next week, and hope to see you here again and chat. And thanks so much for listening, and we'll be back next week.